let's get started. Welcome to this webinar, this panel discussion, a virtual panel discussion about the future of in-space mobility. We want to talk about visions and realities, about the present and the future. There's a couple of organizational things I want to mention. We do encourage people to engage in discussions. We want to have an active discussion. We have really great experts here on the panel across the industry. So we want to answer your questions. We want to address them. There's a couple of ways to do that a little bit later in the webinar. So we will have just short presentations of the three experts about their vision of in-space mobility and how they believe the future will shape. After these quick introductions, we'll have
the thing either turn off. Turn it off all the way, or you open it and you hit the button that says auto and it shuts it off.
All right. We'll have the possibility to ask questions in several ways. There is the possibility to put some questions in the chat already during the initial presentations if you want to. We'll address them then a bit later. You can raise your hand. There's a possibility to raise your hand in the software. I'm sure you will find the hand symbol. So also then we will be able to address you directly to ask your question. If you don't have the chance now, if you don't get the chance, of course, will be available a bit later as well. So let's get started with our expert views here. We have three, as I mentioned, really great experts from the industry, from Momentus, from Lockheed Martin, and from Exotrail, all working very closely from different kind of angles with the topic of in-space mobility. And we'll get started with Negar Feher, who is the Vice President of Product and Business Development at Momentus. And she will get us started with an overview of what's happening in the currently in the domain of in-space mobility and how she sees the future shaping out. Welcome to the panel, Negar. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Alexander. Will you be flipping the slides for me?
Yes, we will.
Okay, great. Thank you. So yeah, I'm excited to be joining this panel and honored. So thank you for having me. I'm just going to go over a bit of an overview in terms of the in-space mobility and transportation market right now. If you could go to the next slide, please. So right now we see transportation as the major enabler of future in space, and we don't think space is unique in this regard. If you look back in history, you can see, for example, that the invention of steam engine and railways led to industrialization. When the turbine and aviation industry picked up, it created a whole tourism industry. And you can see a similar thing going on with the internet and optical fiber and making connectivity available. So space is just going to follow suit, and that's why we see transportation in space as one of the major enablers. And one of the things that the industry needs to do in order to enable transportation is ensure that the cost is affordable, the capabilities are there, and that it's reliable so that people can rely on transporting their goods there. If you could go to the next slide, please. So some of the trends we're seeing today, I'm sure if you're at the SmallSat Conference, you're aware of this. Back 10 years ago, we used to only launch a few satellites. For example, in 2010, we launched 70 on large to mid-size rockets. And the trend is going down in terms of the size of the satellites and increasing in terms of the number of satellites being launched and the size of the rockets. You can see now in 2019, for example, the number is 5 times larger. We've launched 493 satellites on a mix of small dedicated rockets as well as very large heavy lift rockets. And now we're starting to see a mix of small satellites and big satellites. And we predict the trend going forward as, heavier and heavier lift launch vehicles like, New Glenn, like the one Starship, which just did a hop yesterday, for example, from SpaceX, come online and the capacity grows, that the number of satellites launched every year is going to actually double, for example, in the next 10 years. By 2030, we should be estimating like 1,000 satellites launched a year, and we'll see even heavier and larger satellites being manufactured to fit within these rockets, as well as more and more small sats and medium-sized satellites. And the data you see here was taken from an NSR report. Next slide, please. So why are we seeing this? Why is this disruption happening? We believe it's because rockets are constantly, the capacity and the costs are constantly being driven down. So as rockets, let's say back in 1966, they could only carry 8 tons to space. And the price per kilogram was, let's say, $8,000 a kilogram. And then Falcon 9 severely disrupted that. When SpaceX came in, they cut that cost in half and enabled, a new space market to come to bear. And now, in the next 10 years, we see New Glenn and Starship coming online, where we think, today, for example, the cost of launch on a SpaceX Falcon 9 is $5,000 per kilogram. And we predict by the time Starship comes online, that price is probably going to drop as low as $500 a kilogram as the capacity goes up. And we're looking at 150 tons available. Next slide. So, small sats market is following this trend, and this whole market has been enabled by this low cost of launch, and as a result, it's exploded. Like, the number of satellites in the small sat mass class of less than 500 kilograms has grown 3 times, and the applications just keep on increasing to the point where the total addressable market is, $1.5 billion and growing, and it's quadrupling, every year or every 2 years. So it's a great time for the in-space mobility market, given that the demand is coming, and it's kind of like they're both closely tied to each other in terms of the demand coming from the market and the available transportation modes available to get to space. If you could go to the next slide, please. So as we're looking at these trends, and as rockets get larger and larger, there's not ever going to be like situations where you're just going to have, one ginormous 150-ton satellite that's going to take up all the capacity on, let's say, a Starship, or a huge satellite that takes up all the capacity of a New Glenn rocket. There will be more and more small satellites and more satellite aggregation. And as you have more and more satellites aggregated and you want to launch them to space, one rocket cannot efficiently take all these satellites to all the particular orbits that they want to go, even if they have an upper stage booster online. So that's why, having orbit transfer vehicles or space tugs or whatever you want to call it really become key. They really enable satellites to go to various orbits. And as you can see in this example here, instead of going on one rocket, which is an upper stage booster, to a 10 a.m. LTAN, for example, in an SSO orbit, if you have multiple transfer vehicles, you can go to 3-4 different sun crossing times, ranging from 8 a.m. all the way to 11 a.m. using vehicles that enable last mile delivery. And that's why this makes more sense than having a booster. Next slide, please. And as you see, like I was mentioning earlier, as the satellite sizes get smaller and smaller, it becomes more and more advantageous from a cost perspective, from enabling you to use reusable rockets, to use last mile delivery services such as transfer vehicles. And we just see this market growing as time goes on and as rockets go larger and larger. And for example, at Momentus, we have various vehicles in various sizes that grow with the market as the launch vehicle availability comes online. And this is key, we think, in order to enable in-space mobility. If you could go to the next slide, please. And on this last slide, I've just shown you an example of what we see the future of in-space mobility to enable. You know, we see a future where you can go, you know, connect to an asteroid, mine raw materials off of it, such as water, to enable you to go deeper and deeper into the solar system. And we believe in using in situ resources in order to enable you to do this, so that every time you need to go further and further in space, you don't have to come back to Earth to get the propellant needed. So sustainability is also key to having a vibrant space economy, and in-space mobility, of course, is part of that. So that's why our vehicles run on water. I've included my contact info here. If anybody wants to email me or connect with LinkedIn, that would be great. And I look forward to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Negar. This is really a great starting point. I just want to reiterate for those who have joined in the meantime, as we are trying to use the full hour, you know, and started on time, there will be the possibility to ask questions after the first short inputs from our experts here on the panel. Please use the chat or raise your hand later, and we want to have an active discussion in a bit with the audience. Before we get to that, we have two more experts sharing their opinion on the future of in-space mobility and what is already real and what will come in the future. And the next one is Malcolm Young. He's really the one who is kind of doing the trades, you know, between different types of mobility in space, different architectures for missions. So his job description is a staff systems architect, so he's really designing the missions at Lockheed Martin for future missions. But I guess, Malcolm, you can introduce yourself a little bit as well. Welcome to the panel. The floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you, Alex. So my name is Malcolm Young. I'm a systems architect for Lockheed Martin Space in the military space line of business. And my job is evaluating next generation mission architectures and performing trades and system analyses for emerging technologies that are applicable to our customer base. So as you know, I'm sure as many of you are aware that there's a mission need for mobility in space, and that's driven in large part by the proliferation of large satellite constellations. This is become the new paradigm of really across mission domains and across orbit domains to proliferate mission nodes, and managing that node phasing, collision avoidance that potentially becomes more common as a result of that proliferation, and of course to provide the capability of nodes to pivot to new missions or orbit regimes as needed. That becomes more necessary as constellations become larger. Of course, with Lockheed's developing SmallSat, which you may have heard of, and other software-defined satellite type functionality is becoming more common, which enables one set of hardware to perform a variety of potential missions simply through on-orbit software updates. So this could look something like an older government comm node migrating to a privately owned constellation where it might still serve some utility. So in all missions need some form of mobility, and at a minimum to dispose at end of life, to be a good steward of the space environment. And the ability to fit this required function into a vehicle with the minimum swap and minimum complexity, particularly complexity driven to the host mission, encourages that incorporation of that sufficient mobility into all of these proliferated platforms. And these emerging compact and modular systems really enables platform mobility without a significant impact to the program scope or technical risk, which is a primary concern to most of our customers. So LM, and we keep a pretty close eye on these emerging technologies because they enable new missions for our customers, and we're always actively working, developing missions, incorporating some of the technologies on this call, in fact, to demonstrate and build trust in our customer base that the benefits these technologies provide to our customers are indeed really necessary. Highly mobile platforms from a proliferated supply base also gives us the capability to execute some of these next generation proliferated mission architectures. When you're talking about building thousands of satellites in a constellation, that doesn't become the mission of one company. It becomes the mission of an industry. So having cross compatibility, having common interfaces, having part interoperability and mission interoperability becomes really necessary to execute some of these emerging constellation architectures. So I'm really excited to be part of this discussion, and hopefully I can bring a kind of mission integrated, focused perspective to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Malcolm. Very, very much appreciated. And there will be lots of questions that I noted, and I'm sure about from the audience as well, to you at a later point. Before we get to that exciting part, I'm also very happy to have Henri on the panel. He's the founder and CEO of Exotrail, a French startup that initially started to develop and provide Hall effect propulsion solutions, but then evolved into visions of in-space transportation. And I'm really excited to hear his view on this topic as well. So, Henri, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexander, for the quick introduction and for setting up this panel. Exotrail, so I'll start with a very, very brief introduction and then give my thoughts on the topic of in-space mobility. So if you can move to the next slide, please. So just very quickly, that's the core missions that we have at Exotrail, which is eventually to lower, improve deployment of constellation, and later on increase performances and avoid space pollution. And what we are really talking about right now is that first bit, which is how to optimize the deployment of constellation, that because they are constellation have some new needs in a market that is evolving in terms of the needs of these satellites and also the capabilities of new rockets that are being developed. So if you can move to the next slide, please. So I promised at the end of the kind of introduction, but just to give you a brief intro. So we are about 30 people right now. We've raised a bit more than 17 million euros to date. And the way we look at mobility is to provide a set of solutions, because we do not believe that there is one solution to fit all of the use cases of different customers. So that's why we started off with propulsion, onboard propulsion being a way to do this last mile delivery from the launch orbit to the final orbit, and then accelerated recently an on-orbit, let's say a transfer vehicle development, in order to be able to do this last mile delivery, but for nanosatellites mostly that cannot have the capability on board to embark propulsion to do this transfer themselves. And the third bit is simply the way to perform these trade-offs. So the software acts as a way to perform these trade-offs very easily and very quickly. So to allow both launchers and operators to say, okay, well, I have my constellation and I have many ways to be developed and to be deployed on orbits over several altitude, inclination, RAN. And all of these different solutions, whether they are dedicated rockets, whether they are larger rocket, whether they are through onboard propulsion with high thrust, lower thrust, high SP, lower SP, whether they are transfer vehicle with different propulsion on board, all of that will lead to different KPI, whether they are costs, time to orbit. And so the software we are developing is a way to go through this maze in order to provide solutions and let's say design choices fairly easily. And then we can do operation of the spacecraft and so on. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So very simple ways of looking at things for us. And again, we do not think that there is one fit-all solution. And generally, mobility means several things. This can be in LEO, this can be outside of LEO, this can be outside of Earth orbits. Moving, let's say on Earth is pretty simple. You need to move from point A to point B. It's in 2D. Space mechanics is not really. It's more simple when you are on Earth. When you are in space and when you're in LEO particularly, you can actually going from point A to point B can mean a lot of different things. It can mean changing your anomaly, your altitude, your plane, your LTAN, your inclination. And where you're outside of LEO into GTO or GEO, or even, let's say, orbits outside of the Earth's gravitational field, it can be it can lead to very different requirements. What we do and what we start with. Okay, you might have lost me for a bit. I don't know, Alexander, if I'm still online, because I had some.
No,
yeah,
I've been hearing you loud and clear, so I
Perfect.
think we are very good. Yeah.
So yeah, it's just what we master the most right now is Exotrail is the LEO environment, and what we believe is that transfer vehicle, dedicated launcher, onboard propulsion, large rockets are 4 tools to be able to allow constellation to be deployed where they need. And the rule of thumb is, if you have a lot of satellites, then mutualizing, so putting only one propulsion function on one transfer vehicle will allow you to simplify the propulsion capabilities on board every spacecraft. And as a rule of thumb, the more satellites you have to deploy, the more it makes sense to use transfer vehicle. Whereas oppositely, the bigger the spacecraft is, the more capable it is. So in terms of power, mostly. So it makes more sense to put the propulsion on board, and right after the launch, be able to be deployed inside in different planes or altitude and so on. But this again depends on so many things, which can be the size of your spacecraft, your mission, your KPI, whether you favor cost of let's say haste of how quickly you are deployed on orbit. It will lead with different trade-offs. And so the customer then has to make this choice, and this can depend on quantitative elements, namely mission duration, cost, but this also depends on a lot of qualitative elements. And then you can move to the next slide. And the way I see this on-orbit mobility topic is actually by a lot of questions, and all of us who have been involved in that sector with customers, we know that there are some questions which are quite tricky to answer. For instance, about responsibility, where it is, what value a customer will give to responsibility, how does a customer approach risk? Does he want to internalize the risk, meaning in this case going for internalizing the onboard the propulsion onboard its spacecraft, or does he prefer to externalize this risk on an on-orbit transfer vehicle? And this will often depend on the size of the company and the, let's say, history and technological approach of the company. There is also some questions with on-orbit transfer, which is setting up a rideshare, so packaging a lot of different customers does have a cost. Who pays for that? Then there is the thing of whether it is for propulsion system or on-orbit transfer vehicle or dedicated rockets, you will create economics of scales when the number of satellites will increase. And then there is a question, every time you will size a product, this product will address one market. For the business case to close, you need a market to be big enough so that your recurring cost of your vehicle makes sense. And that itself will be a question for every market segment. And reusability does play a lot of roles in transfer vehicle. For instance, if you are able to reuse your transfer vehicle to go back to a kind of launch parking orbit, and then use your vehicle to go again in another deployment orbit, then the business case changes drastically, but that does require some other things happening on the market, for instance, on-orbit refilling, on-orbit repair. So I think that these are all of the questions that affect that mobility problem, and will impact in the next few years and in the next few dozens of years the topic of mobility. And that's what we're trying to be involved in, whether this is on software, on hardware elements. And I'm really happy that this panel occurred, because it shows that there is no one answer, but there is a family of different answers that will make the let's say space an easier place for our customers.
Absolutely. I mean, thanks a lot for ending with questions, which is a really great segue, and I've noted down all of them. So we will try in the next half an hour, with the experts on the panel, and maybe some help from the audience. I saw there's some actual, veterans of the industry joining us here. So feel free to join in the discussion, everyone who has an opinion on this topic. there is a couple of possibilities to raise questions. I want to mention again that we are recording this discussion so that we can share it later with people who have other, parallel activities during this very busy time of SmallSat. But we would still be very happy if you could raise your questions, either post it in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll get to you. In order to get this discussion going, I have a first question, and I would like to start with Malcolm, looking a little bit into the customer perspective and the current status first. So right now we do see a couple of shifts in behavior and in the behavior of customers. And maybe you can elaborate a little bit, Malcolm, on how do you see this whole new space, philosophy, constellation philosophy. What does that mean for companies who are working in the field of in-space mobility? What is required? What is needed? How are things evolving right now?
Sure. Well, I think really the trend is that the new space philosophy is becoming the space philosophy. The old space philosophy of a limited number of exquisite boutique nodes is sort of falling by the wayside as emerging technologies become more capable, and we're sort of in the midst of this cultural shift, both internally to large companies like Lockheed and also amongst our customer base, really driven by cultural shifts in our customer base, that trust in these emerging technologies is growing. And as a result, they're more willing to perform some more critical missions, increasingly critical missions, with more, what are perceived as lower mission assurance technologies, at least with less heritage. It's kind of up to us to show that and really demonstrate on orbit that these missions are feasible and that they can be performed reliably and verifiably reliably and with high mission assurance. And that gets us access to incorporate some of these really promising new technologies that enable new types of missions, not just the ability to perform existing missions more efficiently and more cheaply, but whole new mission regimes that we'd never considered before are enabled by these more compact platforms, by proliferated platforms, and by changing the whole cost paradigm of how much an individual node costs. Well, if you can generate reliability through proliferation instead of reliability on a platform by platform basis, then you totally change how you construct a mission. And that getting customers to really buy in that it's not about reliability on a particular vehicle, it's about reliability of your mission. That's been a completely new paradigm that I've seen arise from the customer side in the last couple of years.
That's interesting, Malcolm, that you mentioned the kind of tolerance to low heritage technologies and products. I would like to play that forward to Negar. I mean, you have announced a couple of deals with heritage companies recently, in reasonably, let's say, heritage-like programs, I would say. If you look at the use cases, how did you, kind of manage to do that in a sense, and also how did you experience this kind of threshold, that is there in between heritage companies like Lockheed, having a push from their customers to be, let's say, very innovative, and cheap, suddenly, but on the other hand, still maintaining their reliability requirements and flowing those down. How did you experience that kind of struggle?
Yeah, so I guess you could say, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Malcolm.
No worries. I guess you could consider Lockheed almost as a loosely associated conglomeration of smaller companies. And Some of those companies exist to service some of our heritage customers that are they're working to service some heritage programs which have much higher mission assurance and mission lifetime requirements. And then there are other organizations which are servicing newer mission architectures, and those are the ones I personally tend to be more closely involved with. And to encourage those customers to adopt some of these newer capabilities, a lot of times what we found is we are internally having to, through IRAD investment, like through Pony Express 1 and 2, going and demonstrating on orbit new technologies, basically performing the full development on IRAD of a saleable product, of a saleable mission, really. And because the customers are still, at least it's, you might find a particular segment of customers are willing to take risks, and they're pulling, just like we're our smaller divisions, our more agile and innovative divisions at Lockheed are kind of pulling along the older organizations into the new space philosophy. Just that same paradigm is happening on the customer side, where you have organizations and the customer that are innovating and pulling along some of those other customer organizations into the new space philosophy.
Thank you.
Negar, is that your way in as well? I mean, is that kind of to find the innovative part of the heritage, association, and then partner with that? Is that your strategy as well?
Yes.
Or did you experience that in a different way?
No, that's exactly correct. And I just want to echo what Malcolm was saying. Basically, we announced yesterday a program actually with Lockheed Martin to fly their new SmartSats when we're flying one of their 3Us in one of our missions in June of next year. And that's where they're going to be testing a lot of the software. And the bus is actually being manufactured by USC. So we are managing to get traction with heritage players and big companies such as Lockheed Martin by partnering with the innovative branches and working with universities that work with them in order to basically lower the barrier to entry, in order to make sure that they are, okay with accepting a certain risk profile and using our services as an early adopter. And we're finding it not being as challenging even with customers such as NASA. With a lot of the bigger players, we're finding a lot of motivation and a lot of urge to adapt to the new space philosophy. So they are lowering their requirements in terms of heritage, and they still want a reliable system. And we have managed to prove our system on orbit. We had our first demonstration, for example, last year on El Camino Real, where we flew the parts of our system that didn't have flight heritage on a demonstration mission in a 16U platform in order to prepare for the next missions that we have, for example, in December of this year and February of next year, where in June, etc., where we plan to fly satellites for numerous customers. So we have de-risked a lot of the platform already, which enables us to capture customers who prefer to have more heritage than less. And yes, I'm pleasantly surprised and happy that we're getting the traction that we are. And in the past, since the whole Corona epidemic and this pandemic has started, we've actually closed a lot of business. I want to say 40% of our contracts have been completed during this time frame. So we're fortunate that people are realizing the value of the services we're offering, and they really value in-space mobility. So I'll leave it at that. I don't want to take up all the time.
No, thanks. Really, I think this is also interesting for our audience to see your view on kind of the current status on how you gain traction and improving space mobility right now. Looking a little bit more into the future. I think one of the, and I would like to direct this question to David, one of the key questions looking into the next years coming up, and that is related to a question that Dale posted on the chat. Please feel free to do that as well. He asked about the holdbacks, for new space and what can be done to alleviate it. I mean, we mentioned already, Negar, to mention, and Malcolm as well, that a lot of the heritage institutions have more innovative parts that can be utilized, or can be worked with if you are a young company or have a new technology. But how do you see the new space, David, segment being not necessarily, the Lockheed Martins, Boeings, and Airbuses of the world, but the smaller kind of CubeSat companies. So like I don't know, Nano Avionics or GomSpace or others, that and I think you have been quite successful in that segment recently. How do you see those kind of high-risk missions that are mainly self-funded or privately funded, so not necessarily following flow-down requirements from government and so on, as enabler in terms of trying out different mobility possibilities, different deployment options, and things like that? Is that an entrance point or a driver?
So what we see from the market is that what I believe is that in terms of constellation of small satellites, most of the operational constellations, I don't think they will be on the CubeSat form factor. So that's why actually, even let's say for us, nanosat CubeSats are a very good way to demonstrate things. And I relate to what Negar was saying, which is this allows you to, let's say, it's really tough to build a 200 kilogram spacecraft just to demonstrate heritage. Putting in your 6U or 12U CubeSat the system or the few systems that are key inside your future 200 kilogram spacecraft, that makes way more sense. And that's how we see things, which is we are talking actively to a lot of customers that do have these mobility requirements on their operational missions. And most of the time they are bigger spacecraft, so from 50 to 150 kilogram satellites. But the fact is that these people, like everyone else in the space industry, they do want to sit on heritage. So when we are able to say, well, yeah, we'll have 3, 4, 5 missions flying in the next 18 months. Yes, they are on CubeSats, but actually the system that we're putting forward on these missions will be either the same or will be modified in a way that we can document, that we can tell you, what changed for your larger spacecraft. But the thing is, it's not exactly like there is always the choice. So, for instance, the fact that we rely more and more on constellations, which is on distributed systems, means that the mobility changes drastically. If you have one, even if it's very large, one Earth observation satellite that is, 1 ton heavy, well, in a sense, there are a lot of questions that you don't really have to ask yourself, which is, okay, you will probably find a rocket that is on the right, L10 altitude. Anomaly doesn't really, matter if you have one spacecraft, whereas inherently, if you have constellations, you have new needs. And because you are playing with smaller satellites, you do need this vehicle either on board or not on board to carry you and deploy you all around the Earth. And it's not exactly like you had access to, for a transfer vehicle, for instance, if you had access right now to a vehicle that has, 50 missions of heritage. So most of the time for heritage, even for heritage customers, the trade-off is not between a heritage solution or a solution that is gradually gaining heritage, but in between a solution that is gradually gaining heritage or had heritage for the past, year or 2 years, and waiting. And waiting takes, time by definition, and also a lot of money. So to a certain extent, we signed, for instance, some contracts with Eutelsat, which is not exactly a type of client which is ready to bargain a lot of heritage, but they're also ready to try out new solutions in a very new space approach, actually, in order to help everyone to gain heritage so that the operational constellation embarks systems with heritage. But most of the time, that's my conviction, a lot of heritage companies as of today have the choice between these new systems with given level of heritage that is gradually increasing and waiting. And they really don't like to wait. So that's my view on that. And in that kind of trade-off, CubeSats are very good because, it's a way to easily and sometimes cheaply demonstrate hardware that then will be reused on smaller satellites. So I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's how I see things. So both decisions from heritage people and the way new companies like us are trying to gradually build that heritage pyramid. That's how I see things.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're touching on a very important thing there. I mean, one of the reasons why customers are embarking new technologies is actually to build up new suppliers that they can then trade in terms of performance at the end, right? This is definitely a motivation of customers, and we see as well. One somewhat related aspects, and I think we have the right crowd of experts here, is somehow the question of responsibility. You raised it, Davi, a little bit in your questions, but I would like to extend it a little bit also to legal responsibility. And especially if we talk about any kind of space tugs, whether it's a space van or whatever kind of system. One of the questions that arises, if we look a little bit more into the future, having more of those systems in place, is what happens if something happens. So whose fault is it, if you I don't know, have a collision with such a vehicle, for example, right? So who is legally kind of responsible for what part of the mission, and what does that responsibility how does that responsibility translate into cost or into consideration of an overall architecture? And I would like to play the ball to Malcolm, asking him, if you consider like an overall mission architecture from really the launch pad to burning up in the atmosphere after deorbiting, where in this trade space is the aspect of responsibility for certain mission aspects playing a role? Is it interesting to externalize risks in order not to be liable for it or not to have it, on your plate, or is that not a consideration? How does that look like?
At least for us, when we're working primarily with government customers, and most of the systems and system of systems that we architect are so expensive that no insurance company on earth would insure it. So usually liability for the safety of hardware is handed off at particular milestones. Like you may say that, all right, after my initial on-orbit checkout, I'm going to hand it off to my customer, and then hands off, it's their liability going forward. And at least from a space domain international liability standpoint, there isn't really a clear legal framework for who's liable for what situation. For instance, like an unintentional collision, for example. That's something that hasn't thoroughly been worked out. So, which is why most of our customers place such an emphasis on clearly understanding and verifying the reliability and mission assurance associated with this flying a set of hardware. If, for instance, you're in a very valuable orbit, like you're in GEO, for instance, the first rule of GEO is don't screw up GEO. So if your customer is signing themselves up to be a steward of a slot in GEO, and they're signing themselves up for being a good, making sure that their hardware cannot fail in such a way that it ruins that slot, or that your vehicle starts drifting and becomes a hazard to adjacent slots. So, which is something that has occurred. So it's in everyone's best interest to make sure that all the hardware that the hardware that we incorporate, that we design with, that we trade with, and incorporate into our systems has a clearly understandable and verifiable level of mission assurance and reliability that we can use to internally understand the risks associated with using that hardware, and that our customers can understand the risk and properly architect systems with the right level of redundancy and reliability that ensures that they're going to be a good steward of their particular slot in space.
Thanks a lot, Malcolm, for that elaboration. I think that's pretty clear. What I would like to follow up with is a question, Negar, asking, I mean, there's one thing that the systems have to work, right, in order not to screw something up. And I think we all share that interest, of having reliabilities, that really, especially in the domain of mobility, this is really something, that's mission critical and can generate a lot of debris or avoid it. So we are definitely, all of us, asked to be responsible. But looking more on the operation, even if everything works, right, you still have potential collisions, you still have that you need to avoid, you still have to make correction maneuvers and stuff like that. So if you, with your, Negar, this is to you, if you with your transportation vehicle, are basically, or any other, are transporting satellites to their final orbit from a launch system, who is responsible for that transit? So because you have a certain window in which you are released, right, there's some uncertainty, you have to correct your transfer maneuver, I would assume, you have to kind of, so are you promising to your customer a delivery to a certain slot, and whatever happens in between is basically your responsibility, including all collision avoidance and any other maneuvers? Or is the operation of the transfer also part of the customer mission, and you're just providing the hardware to do it? How does that work?
No, so Momentus operates on a service model. So just like a rocket, when you buy a launch and it takes you to space, you don't own and operate the rocket. Our vehicles are the same way. Our transfer vehicles, we integrate all the payloads on the ground, we put them on our vehicle, we put them on top of a launch vehicle, and once released from the launch vehicle, for example, on our first Vigoride mission in December of this year, once we're released, all the liability lies in our hands to provide the service of transporting the satellites on board from where we get dropped off from the launch vehicle to where our customers want to be. For example, in February, we're going to get dropped off by a Falcon 9 rocket in a 450 kilometer orbit. Once released from that orbit, a lot of our customers have licenses where they need to operate at 550 kilometers, for example. So the liability stands on Momentus from the point of release to complete commissioning and transport the satellites to the 550 kilometer orbit, and then release each of the customers where exactly they want to be, phase them apart, etc. And at that point, the responsibility is on us to make sure that they're placed, and released significantly, delayed from each other so that there's no risk of collision, there's no problems of generating space debris or anything of that nature. And we take on all that responsibility as we have a service model. Our customers don't own and operate our vehicles. They merely buy a service to be transported to a particular spot.
Do you see that to be the future of mobility in space, to basically have something like an Uber, where you say, I want to go from A to B, pick me up and, drop me off there? Do you think that that's going to be the future of in-space mobility? I
think so. I think I'm finding, and our customers can confirm that's the model that our customers actually prefer, and they want to make it as easy. We want to make it as easy as possible for them, and they appreciate that. For example, they don't want to buy a launch and then buy our service separately and then manage all of these all of this hardware and services. They prefer that we do everything for them as a white glove service. So they like to come to us and be like, Negar, we want you to drop us off at, let's say, an 800 kilometer SSO orbit, or we want you to drop us off at this very specific point, and we go and take care of the rest. And we're finding that they don't want to have multiple contracts. So they're happy to just sign one contract with us and have us go procure the launch, build the transfer vehicle, do the integration, transport them there, do all the launch operations and in-space operations. And another service that, that we started offering to the market as of this week, because of the demand from our customers, is actually a hosting service. So they said, okay, Negar, let's take it a step further. We don't even want to build the satellite anymore. We just want to use your bus, and we want to run this experiment. We want to test these new solar cells. We want to deploy this, deployable antenna. We want to do this X, Y, Z on your platform. Since you're already launching it, you're going to be in space. Once you're done deploying everybody else, can you run this experiment for 6 months to a year for us? And the answer is yes. So we started even doing that. So we're finding more and more people prefer satellite as a service over buying satellite hardware and having to own and operate it themselves. It simplifies their life. They don't have to deal with licensing. They don't have to deal with launch. They don't have to deal with operations on orbit and the building, the hardware, and everything else. They can simply focus on the area that brings money into their business, which is the payload. So that's become a very popular thing for a demand from our customers, and we can host payloads up to like 300-400 kilograms on our platform, and which we call Vigoride, or we can take satellites that are that big, and then our platforms just grow over time. So we're finding demand for larger and larger satellites, and we're seeing a trend that as the cost of launch comes down, people are wanting to build larger and larger satellites, because you can see that the cost to launch, a CubeSat, 10 years ago is equivalent to a 200-kilogram satellite today. So somebody who would have built a CubeSat 10 years ago today is going to build a 200-kilogram satellite. So as we see people's demand for larger and larger microsats and satellites grow, our platforms grow with it. So the next one we're introducing after Vigoride, for example, is Arteride, which can handle like 2 tons of satellites and go all the way to GEO or lunar orbit. So we're just starting in LEO as we find more early adopters and people were interested in doing experiments in the low Earth orbit realm, but the demand for GEO and lunar and MEO and all of that still exists. And the reason why, for example, I believe you don't see a huge market in MEO is just because it's hard to get there. There's not that many launch options there, and people, would love to, have a Molniya orbit or a Tundra orbit or things of that nature for specific applications. But a lot of times the business case hasn't been able to close because it's just too expensive to get there, say an equatorial orbit. So we're hoping to bridge that gap and allow, people to move freely throughout the solar system. That's actually our mission statement. And to build all the infrastructure.
I think you're raising a couple of very interesting points there, and I want to have the chance, because we don't have too much time left now, to kind of pinpoint on one of them a little bit further. And that is the question of, we were talking about. There's always the kind of satellites as a service discussion going on, and I think there's a couple of panels also during the SmallSat related to that. That's not necessarily the focus here, but even looking into mobility as a service, I've noticed that Henri, in your future plans, you've mentioned a couple of times reorbiting or deorbiting of satellites. And you see that a lot. If you talk about in-space mobility, you see a lot of things related to not just, kind of the last mile problem that we've been discussing quite a lot now, with the delivering to a specific point, but also to relocate satellites, to actually go to a state where we have some sort of an Uber in space, or on-demand mobility in space. We need to have the capability to go somewhere, pick them up in whatever way, and then relocate them or deorbiting them. Then we kind of decouple the mobility of the platform from the capability of the individual propulsion system or the transport vehicle or whatever. So my question to David is, as you have that in your visions and in the future, how do you see, and in what time frame do you see that happening? And what, apart from propulsion, do you see as enablers? I mean, I'm thinking about proximity operations, dockings, and so on. So what is your view on how far away are we from relocating something on orbit?
So you are correct in saying that for me, you have the satellite itself, and then you have the payload itself. And then you have a certain amount of things that allow this payload to operate. That's on the bus side. And our vision is that there are a certain number of things that allow this payload to move. Okay, and this can be onboard propulsion, on-orbit transfer vehicle, on-orbit servicing vehicle. And yes, we strongly believe that right now, for instance, if you launch a constellation, you will consider the geometrical configuration, for instance, of that constellation. So meaning the number of planes, the number of satellites per plane, the phasing in between different anomalies as a constraint. And from that, you will derive if you're doing Earth observation, for instance, a coverage, resolution, and so on. And what we are saying is that if this is not a constraint, but it's a variable, then through not only hardware, but also software, you can reconfigure your constellation so that you get access to new performances, so that you can favor areas of interest, for instance, if you're doing Earth observation that favors your business more. And this requires both software capability, so strong optimization techniques to allow you to find this optimal configuration, and this hardware segment, which is this thing that will allow you to relocate, change the position of your spacecraft. And this can be many things. We've discussed about transfer vehicle and onboard propulsion, which have their own challenges in terms of technological development, pricing, and so on. And there is the whole topic of on-orbit servicing. I'm not, let's say, on-orbit servicing for me, I define it by doing something from space to space, so something with a satellite to another satellite. And this can be contacting the satellites, and this can be deorbiting, changing its orbit. This could be in the future also repair, assemble these satellites, but it's, let's say, another topic. And this comes with its own set of challenges. And as you mentioned, some technological challenges. So definitely on-orbit servicing, you need to be able to contact a satellite. So you need to be able to approach it. You need to be able to do that with a reliability figure that is extremely high. And why is that? Is because, as Malcolm said, well, I believe that most of these applications arise in GEO. It doesn't really make sense to come with a space tug to change the course of your 100-kilogram spacecraft in LEO. That I'm quite convinced. Doing this in GEO, whether it's for life extension, whether it's to free a slot, whether it's to put something in graveyard orbit, whether it's to, let's say, reorbit something that is still functioning, most of the use case and the business case we see are in GEO. And because the last thing you want is to screw GEO, as Malcolm said, you need to have access to reliability proximity navigation, which is definitely a challenge. So that's one of them. Business cases of these missions is also a challenge. But I do believe that overall, whether it's in GEO for telecommunication satellites, whether it's in LEO with onboard propulsion, after the satellite has been deployed in space, I think that considering that the position of this satellite is fixed might be a mistake, and that assuming that this configuration and this slot is a variable opens up new capabilities in telecommunication and in Earth observation. That's our view, and you are totally correct. And there are some hardware and technological developments that are space development where we invest quite a lot also is on the software side of it. So being able with a given constellation to not think, okay, I have my constellation, these are the performances that you get out of this constellation, but doing the opposite. How do I get the optimal constellation and the optimal configuration to give a given level of service to my customers? And that's, I think, an interesting trend for the future.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. We are unfortunately at the end of the hour of the panel discussion. I think there's lots of additional questions and lots of additional topics we could probably go on for another hour. I would still like to end the kind of formal part here. As I mentioned, we have recorded the webinar, so whoever is coming late now or has come late, you want to get started or see the beginning and our expert views and their presentations, we'll put the video online probably next week after the SmallSat, so you can follow that as well. So have a look out for that. There's also a party after lunch, I guess. Momentus is throwing a party in an hour or two, I believe. Negar, please correct me. It's probably going to be fun. So if you want to regroup there and kind of continue the discussion, I will also continue to be on that on this channel here for a little bit. If some of the other audiences or panelists want to stay a couple of minutes to answer some questions, that's fun as well. So I really want to thank everyone for their inputs to this discussion. Negar, thank you very much. Malcolm, David, it was really a pleasure talking to you, even though the time was way too short to cover everything that is to be said about in-space mobility. I think there's definitely a lot of exciting things happening right now, and the future has just begun, I would say. So thank you everyone for this interesting discussion.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Alex. I've also put the link for the party in the chat window. If anybody would like to join us, we're going to have a DJ, live performances, talent show, and a list of panels. So if you want to talk more, we'd love to have you at our party. Today it's from 1 to 4 Mountain Time, 12 to 3 Pacific Time. So I hope to see most of you there. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Thanks for posting that.
Thanks a lot, Alexander, for setting up this panel. So was, I think, way too short, as you say, but it's always too short to have interesting discussions. So we'll do another one in Logan next year on live.
Absolutely.
I look forward to that. And I hope next year we'll all be saying, oh, yes, and we flew. And before you know it, we're going to do rendezvous proximity ops and transport things to the moon. That's
absolutely. Let's all work on that. Very good. All right. If someone has any questions from the audience who is here, please feel free to chat. Just unmute yourself. We'll just continue with an open discussion. If you want to say something, feel free. We have really great experts here. Otherwise, I'll see you at the party, I guess.
Alex, would you like me to stay online or?
No, it's fine, guys. I guess you know, it's a busy time in SmallSat. That's fine. Thanks a lot.
I just wanted to add one point before I hang up. That I didn't get a chance to. People can sign off if they need to. There was a question about what are some of the holdbacks for new space. I just want to echo a little bit of what David was saying. I find that so a lot of the holdbacks for a lot of the new space companies is funding related, and a lot of the funding constraints and the difficulties in terms of raising the funds comes from not having demonstrations in orbit. So if I had one recommendation to the new space industry and people coming in is to move fast and try to get a demonstration on orbit as soon as possible. You can do that through a lot of different means. It could be a hosted payload. It could be you just throw your technology on a CubeSat and get it up there and get some operational experience on orbit, which will enable you to raise a lot more funds and go further. So that's what I would say is I think people, and sometimes it's not their fault. They'll book a launch. The launch gets delayed 6 months to a year, and then that just kills their business plan. So launch diversity is also really important. Make sure you have various options to get your demonstration up to space so that it doesn't, kill your business plan. I found that to be very effective at Momentus. Like from the point we started, when I joined the team, within 6 months we flew a demo. From the point we decided we're going to fly a demo to the point it was ready to fly. It was incredible, but it is possible to do it in a very short period of time. And given all the, inexpensive means of getting to space nowadays, there's no reason why you couldn't do something like that. So that would be my recommendation.
The interesting thing, though, Negar, is that I find that as well. If you fly something yourself, you turn it on, and you are suddenly a tier 9, right? I mean, at least that's what people think, which is obviously not true, because if you look at the TRL tables, If you demonstrate something in space, you're actually just at 7, right? So the misperception that is really happening a lot is that people are completely omitting any term of life, expectancy of anything, right? So you fly it, you turn it on, and suddenly you're flight proven, and everything's fine, right? Which is a great entrance point, but the kind of tricky part of it is it's a little bit like you market something in the supermarket, right? It's a super shiny product, you get people to grab it, to take it home, but then they open it and they have to see what they have been expected. You have to deliver at the end of the day, and that happens sometime during the operational mission when things are still operating reliably or just falling apart after a while. So I do agree with you. It's good to fly something early, but the kind of caveat is that you have to have yourself the responsibility, or you have to put on yourself the responsibility of making sure it works for a long time as well, because the customers might ask you too late, right, for that question, and then you might not have an answer, right? That's a little bit the kind of word of caution that I would put out there with respect to that.
Yeah, I would definitely place some emphasis on that. A lot of these companies will report TRL 9 for products, but there's different flavors of TRL 9 where we'll dig into it and we'll see, oh yeah, it has on-orbit heritage, but they've done 10 design revisions since then, or if it's it's not lot common parts with what they've demonstrated before, or there's no life testing reliability characterization on lot common parts, or they haven't performed life testing long enough to understand the radiation survivability of the component. So there's ways you can eat into those different areas of uncertainty with either additional testing or extended on-orbit demonstrations. But every change between your next product sold and what you've demonstrated before becomes an area of uncertainty. And a lot of it's not necessarily less reliable, but you don't know the reliability. And at least to our customer base, unknown or uncertainty or against any particular aspect of the system becomes perceived as infinite risk, even if it's its perception is 9/10 of reality in this case. So you can and you want to avoid giving them any avenue to eat into the perceived mission assurance of your product.
I think that what matters at the end is also transparency. Simply, I think, in my opinion, is a good approach to say, I want to fly early, and then you could have in some cases products that are not identical to what you've flown, as long as this is documented and you have a transparency level with your customers. Then the decision is taken by both your customers and you, and the risks are understood and shared. That makes sense for me. Because I think you need to find a middle ground between getting the heritage. So to a certain extent, I really agree to what Negar was saying, which is, human brain works as follows, which is you want to fly something, and then the time is the consequence of what you want to do. And what we try to do is to say the time is the constraint, and what you can fly will be the consequence. And then this will lead to this. You need to do regularly, of course, otherwise you do not progress on what you fly. And from your last version that has flown, then you need to document all the design changes and be transparent with your customers, so that they accept or they don't, but at least when they do, they know what they accept. And generally speaking, whether it's for TRL and non elements, we need to be careful on let's say public announcements, because it's always and particularly in this segment, always a bit tricky to say what's true, what's really So yeah, that's just my 2 cents really, but I think both approach make sense as long as you have transparency.
Yeah, Davey, I would completely agree in transparency, and that's I think a strong lessons learned from us, that when dealing with new space companies. One example, we received a component for characterization testing from a supplier, and we initially requested testing or verification evidence against their performance specifications. And they were like, oh, no, that's proprietary information, that's trade secret, sorry, we can't show you, which was a little bit of a red flag. But we're like, okay, fine, we'll go verify ourselves what your performance is. So we went and characterized their product, and they failed every single test that we gave them. In fact, they every single one of their specs was the product that they shipped us was out of spec for every single performance item that they had advertised. So that doesn't, that sort of behavior ends up damaging reputation of adjacent companies. It's like, all right, well, what could have been easily resolved saying, oh, no, well, sorry, we underperform here and here and here, became oh, well, because you lied here, we can't trust anything that you send us. So that was damaging not only to that one company's reputation, but it became more difficult to deal with any other small space company in the same product set. So it's advantageous for the whole industry really to be as transparent as possible, that nobody's out to steal your technology. Everybody wants to make a mission work. So everybody has aligned goals to make the mission work and to make their customers trust that the mission will work. So NDAs exist for a reason, and you can trust that generally companies will ethically and abide by their legal agreements, and to be willing to share your information as needed to make sure that people trust that the mission's going to work.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. If I have one supplier that will lie on one element of their spec sheet but doesn't tell me, versus a supplier that has 3 elements of their spec sheet that are wrong, but he tells me, I will always work with the second one in the future, because problems always arise, in some elements with. So at the end of the day, the thing that needs to be there is transparency. As long as you have transparency, well, then perhaps you will ditch that supplier, but at least you will be able to work with him in some problems. And I really don't understand in what you say is, okay, what's the decision process behind that? Because it's really short term, from your suppliers, which makes it quite surprising, because you will not really build a strong company out of this. So yeah, it's really an interesting story that you say, because decision process of some suppliers are a bit tricky sometimes.
Well, it becomes it's a funding issue as well. Some of these, in the startup world, funding issues lead to desperation, and a lot of these startup companies have short runways, so they're really desperate to move some product in certain cases. But it's tricky for them really, because they have to balance the needs of keeping their company in business against the needs of maintaining a reputation and building a reputation for their company that's going to give them sustainable growth into the distant future.
I think you're right. That the problem is funding milestones.
Yes,
that I think.
Yeah, and that's why we always make sure that we have a long enough runway to not have to run into such problems, and be conservative in terms of our cash spend, and make sure that we raise the appropriate amount of funds at every milestone. And that's why I'm really happy that we were able to raise like over $50 million and continue to grow since our inception. So we don't have to resort to such things. So we hope to be as transparent as possible. And I do agree. I used to work for Maxar, which was the division, SSL, which then later became Maxar. And we did have such problems with some of our new space vendors. So I know exactly what you're talking about, where they promised to do something and then they deliver like 6 months late, and it wasn't what they said that they were going to deliver. So that is definitely a problem that needs to be solved in the new space industry, is making sure that the delivery timelines are correct and that people actually deliver on what they promise, in order to help this industry and this sector flourish.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I mean, it can go both ways, right? I just remember I recently had a discussion with one of the large space platform providers, where in the contracts, you know, that we were negotiating, they were basically, we were trying to introduce an early delivery clause, and they were really not understanding what we want. And we only wanted for them, if we deliver early, to pay early, right? And really, they told us, you know, after like an hour of discussion, now we understand what you want. We've never had this issue. So, you know, so yeah, things are different in the new space kind of domain. If you go into serial production of products, you know, and you deliver something off the shelf, you know, to someone who wants to have a bi-weekly progress report meeting or something, you know, there's a learning curve, I think, for both sides of that bargain, right? So, and it can happen, and it can be successful. At the end of the day, I think we have to understand that it's a very small industry. It's very much based on personal credibility. You know, we need to trust each other if we make business together. And yeah, I think you all echoed that. Can I just, I mean, we have a couple of guests still hanging out. Thanks for that. So we are kind of continuing our discussion. Is there any questions that you have? Don't be shy. Nope. Well, otherwise, I don't know if you want to have any more comments. Otherwise, Negar, I think you have to prepare your party.
Yes, I need to go set out the drinks. You know, I'm so sorry I can't serve you guys Moscow meals and everything, but hopefully you come with your own drinks and come enjoy some of our performances that, you know, various team members have prepared, anything from singing to dancing to cooking to, you know, if you have any talents, you can perform them live too. It should be pretty entertaining and a nice break from all the panels and, you know, conferencing and meetings. So I hope some of you join us.
All right. Great. If there's no further questions, then I would say we end it here. It was really great fun. Thanks again for participating, guys. And I'll see you all soon in person again, I hope.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.